Well, good morning, friends. Good morning and welcome back to our fall convocation. It's good to see all of you. I hope you helped yourself to some coffee and beverages and pastries. Those will continue to be out there, so please make yourself at home. Also, want to remind you about Jennifer Cowley, who's doing art just right outside. If you haven't stopped to observe that, I hope that you will. And we also still have books for sale, so if you haven't purchased your books yet, you can do that too. Who's glad to be here this morning? It's been wonderful, hasn't it? Amen. Okay, well, I'm pleased to welcome back Dr. Noreen Herzfeld, who's here to give her second lecture. And I also want to tell you that we will do some more Q&A afterwards. If you have questions, jot those down. And again, we'll sort of circle the crowd with mics later on. So glad you're all here this morning, Dr. Herzfeld. Welcome.
Good morning. Okay, so today's topic, we're going to talk about art. And in particular, I want to use art, namely the icon, as a sort of case study of some of the things we talked about yesterday. So you'll hear some of the ideas that we talked about yesterday come back, but after 40 years of teaching, I know that hearing something twice doesn't hurt. So, but let's think about, first of all, AI technologies. It happens in the cloud. And we think about the cloud in many ways that we think about heaven, right? Like it's up there somewhere and it's all sort of disembodied. And, things are sort of floating around out there. So we imagine God and the communion of saints existing sort of as if they existed in the cloud, right? So this raises some spiritual questions. Like, what effect will AI have on our spirituality? Do we still need the material world for spiritual life, or would the virtual world, in a way, work better because it would seem closer to our imagination? The theologian Walter Burghardt talks about spirituality as taking a long, loving look at the real. So my question today is, will AI help this, or will it stand in the way of our taking a long, loving look at the real? So will the machine open new portals for us and for our spiritual experience, or will it close them off, or will it do both? So there's the question. Now, AI-generated art has been mocked for being unworldly, for having inconsistencies, but there have also been a number of AI-generated pieces that have actually won prizes at art fairs. So here's one of them, and you can see it got first place at the Colorado State Fair, and it does have a sort of otherworldly, spiritual kind of quality. So while in the art world, people have talked about AI-generated art and said, well, it can't be truly creative because it's trained on works that are already out there, that were done by other artists, we might think about some of the criticisms that are made and say, well, yeah, but what about icons? If we go back to our icons, well, they're kind of otherworldly too, aren't they? Icons don't always use the perspective of the normal world. And icons are also kind of formulaic. In other words, an iconographer is not supposed to go out there and create something completely new. Iconographers are expected to base their work on the tradition and what has already been done in the past. So both AI-generated art and icons impose their own principles on the spectator. In Orthodox theology, icons are windows to the transcendent world. They represent a meeting place between those of us on earth and the community of saints in heaven. And they have a sacramental quality, though they are not a sacrament, because they are rooted in a material object, and yet it is through this material object that we have a window that opens us up to the immaterial. And I want here to quote the experience of looking at an icon that was sent to me in a letter a long time ago by a friend who lived in Russia. And he wrote, "Every time I am in Moscow, which I used to visit quite often, I go to the Tretyakov Gallery and head straight for the icon rooms, straight for 3 large icons by Andrei Rublev. The face of Christ draws me more powerfully than any other." There it is. "And I think it is because I feel that I am in the presence of a true embodiment of spirit in flesh. I feel soothed, welcomed, transported away from the mundane. When sitting before Rublev's face of Christ, the last thing I think about is myself. I'm drawn out and away into something that I cannot really describe, but it is a wonderful place to be. For I feel that there I am not alone. I see the image clearly in my mind's eye, even as I write. All the suffering of human life, all the peace and quiet bliss of the eternal spirit." This writer is describing a tripartite experience of encounter that involves himself, Rublev the artist, and Christ, facilitated by this icon. So our question is, what if one party to this, namely the iconographer, is a machine instead of a human being? As AI moves from being a tool to an independent creator, what remains that is distinctly human? So, to answer these questions, we're going to do these things this morning. So, I want to talk first a little bit about generative AI and how it actually works. Then, icons and materiality. Are we reopening the iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries? What about spiritual deskilling for the iconographer? So how will using AI as a tool to create an icon change the work of the iconographer? And then what about the venerator, the person who actually uses an icon as an aid to prayer? And finally, what about the larger liturgical community and icons' role in that? So first, let's talk a little bit about generative AI. You can see here that generative AI is a subset of something that's called deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, which is a subset of the whole general idea of AI. Well, machine learning means that the machine learns through a process. So there's input, the features of that input are extracted by a human being, and then the machine has a series of layers of nodes, and these nodes, in a sense, set up probabilities for what features belong with each other, for understanding what certain features are and are not. And then you get some output. So you can see the simple example here is the input's a car, the person at the machine, and we talked yesterday about how this might be somebody in Africa or Southeast Asia, in a sweatshop who's looking at a picture and is labeling, that's a car, okay, that's a car. And then this goes into the machine, and then the machine becomes able to reproduce cars, if it's generative AI, or identify cars, if it's an AI program that is just looking at a picture and trying to figure out what is there. Now, once you have a certain amount of machine learning, the machine can do deep learning. In this case, it extracts the features itself from what it's looking at. And then from many, many iterations of trial and error, it sets up the probabilities. Deep learning is what is used to train things like DALL-E and Midjourney, where it just looks at data sets of many, many pictures, figures out what certain features are, and then figures out the probabilities of how those features are put together with colors and pixels. Okay. So we also have on top of this a second technology, and that's large language models. Large language models set up the interface between the user and the program so that the user can put in a prompt in English or whatever language, usually it's English for these programs, of what they would like. So if you say, I want a picture of 2 cats drinking wine in the style of Van Gogh, you can get a picture of 2 cats drinking wine in the style of Van Gogh. Okay, so the large language model sets up probabilities in order to understand language. So, here you can see how a picture might be labeled. Here's the car, here's the car, here's the truck. And then we put that together to, figure out that if you asked for a picture of a street scene with many cars and trucks in the style of Van Gogh, it would know, okay, many cars, yep, cars, we'll put cars in there. And then it would put on top of that the stylistic features that you were looking for. Okay, now we know that there are problems that sometimes come up with AI-generated photos or AI-generated paintings. One of the problems that is really common is hands. Hands are really difficult because in a picture, you usually don't see all of the fingers, right? Or you have hands together. You have 2 people shaking hands, or you have somebody clasping their hands, and so you see lots of fingers. Now, one of the problems with these programs is they do not have mental models. We have mental models. We know what a hand is. And we know that a hand has 5 fingers, usually. Okay. And the computer does not. It only knows what it sees in pictures. And unfortunately, what it'll see in pictures is, a hand with some fingers that are hidden, or 2 hands together, so there's lots and lots of fingers. And so it has no way of knowing a hand should have 5 fingers. So that means you'll often see pictures, of 6 fingers or 3 fingers or whatever on a hand. It also has no conception of space because all it's concerned with is putting the right colors together on the page. So you can get pictures, like the other example here with the unicorn, here's a picture of, an old man embracing a unicorn, and the unicorn, it's going right through his head. Well, you probably don't want that, but the machine has no way of understanding that this would be a problematic situation. Okay. So we get hallucinations, and a lot of this is because it has no internal models of the world. One of the things that we learn starting from being very young children is to set up these internal models of the world. If you think about all the things that kids are learning when they're playing. I often think, and this doesn't fit with art, but think for a minute about a kid playing in a sandbox. Okay, we think, okay, they're just playing, they're not really learning anything. It's, not like when they're learning their letters or their numbers, but they're learning a lot. They're learning about fluid dynamics when they're pouring sand from one thing to another. They're learning about gravity and how that works. They're learning about textures, and they're setting up a mental model of what is sand, but also of how do things move in the world. And then, when Bobby throws sand in Susie's faces, he's learning about human relationships and how they can go wrong sometimes. So we are setting up these mental models as children, and the machines do not have these. So that makes them brittle. It makes them prone to break down on edge categories. When you're asking them to do something that was not explicitly in their training set. Okay. So now let's go back. I'll take my computer science hat off now, put on my theologian hat, and let's talk a little bit more about icons. Okay, so icons and materiality. Icons are material objects, and the iconoclasts back in the 8th and 9th centuries argued that a material object could not capture the divinity of Christ, for example. And their biggest objection was to portraying Christ in an icon, but also Mary and the saints. To venerate an icon was considered at best venerating the human form of Christ or the saints, and at worst, of venerating the icon itself, which they said was idolatry. Now, they were putting the image together with identity. And they said, the only proper material object we can associate with Christ is the bread and the wine of the Eucharist, because we were called to do that. But the Orthodox refutation of this said, no, because Jesus was incarnated in the flesh, he made all of materiality able to carry divinity to us. And that divine energy can take material form and become a locus of grace. Okay? So in Ephesians 1:10, it says, in the fullness of time, God will unite all things in heaven and things on earth. So to the Orthodox, they said the icon is an expression of this union of things in heaven and things on earth. Firstly, because it depicts God become flesh, or flesh become God. So if it's Jesus, it's God become flesh. If it's the saints, it's flesh become God. And secondly, the icon itself becomes a material bearer of uncreated grace. So, as one Orthodox priest puts it, traditional iconography is less about what we see and more about who sees us. Although it's certainly part of the remit of the icon to teach and catechize the people, the primary function is to remind us of the presence of the invisible, not a view of something that we could have seen simply with physical eyes. It reminds us that God's divinity permeates everything, permeates the entire world. So, because of this, iconographers said the material doesn't matter. An icon is often painted on wood, but it could be made of metal, it could be a sculpture, but the material must be there so that we see this idea of God being present in the entire material world. So what they did say was the icon cannot be just a vision or a mental image. Okay? St. Theodore wrote, if merely mental contemplation were sufficient, it would have been sufficient for Jesus to come to us in a merely mental way. And consequently, we would have been cheated by the appearance both of his deeds, if he did not come in the body, or of his sufferings, which were undeniably the same as ours. So they're saying, it's not good enough to just have a mental image of Jesus, because that's not the experience of the incarnation. No, you could say, okay, so this is a problem with an AI-generated icon because it's really nothing but numbers and probabilities, and that makes it a mental sort of thing. But then I could say, well, but wait a minute. When the AI generates the icon, it doesn't have to just appear on the screen as an evanescent image that'll disappear as soon as I turn my computer off. I could copy it onto wood with paint. Okay? Or I could run it through my printer, right? And put that up on my wall. So an AI-generated icon can be transferred to the material. So the question here is that the same as painting an icon? Now, one part of the Orthodox tradition would say no, because they would say, when you take a piece of wood and you paint on it with tempera paints, or you put a little metal on it, some gold probably, then what we are representing is the redeemability of the animal, vegetable, and mineral world and their union with the spiritual. So they would say, well, an icon that's made with paint is also honoring not just the saints, or Christ. It's honoring the whole natural world and saying Christ redeemed them too. Also, when you write or paint an icon, they call it writing an icon, you layer the paints. And they said, well, now this represents the idea of deification, that God became human so that humans might become God. And that as we grow in the likeness of God, we get closer and closer and closer to being divine ourselves. And they said, as we layer the paints on and the image begins to appear, we see this process of taking the material and bringing it into the divine realm. Okay, what about an AI-generated icon? Does this honor the material world in the same way? Well, here, I can take you back to some of the things we talked about yesterday. In other words, no, an AI-generated icon is actually doing damage to the natural world. And so, we'll talk about this really quickly because I talked about this yesterday, but here you can get some more details. So one of Microsoft's newer server farms, tens of thousands of computers. They use 30% more energy than the entire county where they're located. This is the one that uses as much energy as 40,000 homes. Yeah, wow, it's a problem. Okay. We also can look at the carbon footprint of what is happening with AI. And we see some of the training data here, that training a typical large language model emits about 8 to 9 times the lifetime emission of a mid-sized car, or the same as 2,000 round-trip flights from London to Rome. That's a lot of emissions. And you can read that if data centers were a nation, They would be somewhere in between Japan and India in the amount of energy they use in a year. And by 2030, it's estimated that in some countries, data centers will use up as much as almost a third of their annual energy consumption. So on a purely practical level, I would say, don't go around just generating lots of icons with AI for fun, because look what you're doing to the world. And we don't know, most people don't know this. And when you think about, like, students who are trying to generate something with AI, they don't just give it one prompt and generate one picture. They go through iteration after iteration after iteration after iteration to get what they want. And so I think we all need to become more aware of the natural resources that we are using when we do this. It's not just a toy that we should play with, for fun. And I could just generate hundreds of images. Isn't this fun? This is why the AI companies right now are losing billions of dollars every year, because right now they're letting us do this for free. It won't be free forever. Okay? Now, let's also think about that process of generating image after image after image and how that compares to the iconographer's process of painting layer after layer after layer of paint. So, my next question is AI a good iconographer? What does it do to the role of the iconographer? There's a spiritual element to the writing of an icon that I would say gets stripped away here. The iconographer is supposed to pray with tears so that God can penetrate into his soul and begin with the understanding that writing an icon is a divine art transmitted to us by God himself. As one Orthodox priest put it, this is outer work that becomes inner work. The discipline is as much spiritual as it is artistic. The iconographer is supposed to develop a relationship with the saint or Christ that is being depicted. And then they set up that tripartite relationship that I spoke of earlier when I quoted my friend in Moscow. Now, in a digital reproduction, this triangle will be changed because the iconographer would become a machine, right? So you can say, well, what about a digital reproduction of an icon? In a digital reproduction of an icon or a print of an icon, which is probably what most of us have at home, right? Because we can't afford the real things. You're still seeing something that was conceived of, informed by a human iconographer who was in relationship with his or her subject. You lose the hand of the artist. In other words, you're not going to see the brush strokes, you're not going to see the layering in the same way, but you're still seeing the form as conceived by another human being. If the icon is generated by an AI program, the relationship between the icon writer and the saint is lost because an AI program can't have a relationship like that. It has no internal models, remember, so it has no knowledge of the symbolism of what it's copying. Obviously, it does not engage in prayer and contemplation while it's doing this. And it simply knows what colors ought to be juxtaposed next to other colors based on statistics, basically. So, I would say clearly an AI program all by itself can't really be a good iconographer. the spiritual relationship between the iconographer and the saint is lost. But we don't have to go that far, right? In other words, you can say, well, but we don't have to let the AI program do it all by itself. A human iconographer might collaborate with an AI, using the program to generate the initial template, then modifying the output with a series of tailored commands until it finally produces an icon that they like. Then they can look at that icon as a template, grab a slab of wood, and paint it, right? So why would that be a problem? Okay. I would say, well, here's the problem. Think about the iconographer's process in doing this, especially if they don't actually then grab the slab of wood and paint it, but they just run it out of the printer then, or put it up in cyberspace. The focus of the iconography or the iconographer is going to be on the vagaries of the program, not on the saint. Okay? In other words, what they're going to have to do is give it prompt after prompt after prompt, and they're going to be, looking at what the program comes up with and then saying, oh, wait a minute, the hand's got to have 5 fingers, So they're going to be using words as their tool. And we know that words are notoriously bad at expressing holy visions. So, art is, as our other speaker said yesterday, it's a physical thing, right? And putting it into words is not going to be the same experience. I think what we have here is a case that is part of a general template that we talked about yesterday, which is that AI tends to de-skill humans. Okay, no matter what the task is, if we rely on a machine to do the work, we do not hone our own skills. The philosopher Shannon Valor has called this moral de-skilling, and she's used it to describe what happens when AI takes on roles that humans would do, such as making military decisions or such as caretaking of children or the elderly, where she says is as much as we give parts of these tasks over to machines, we lose the chance to grow morally by doing it ourselves. If you think of caretaking, as I mentioned yesterday, we lose the chance to grow in patience, to listen to the wisdom of the elderly, to grow in our empathy and our ability to love. So widespread use of AI as a tool in icon writing, I think, could result in a sort of spiritual de-skilling, where the focus gets transferred from the saint to the program and to the material form. In other words, no, it's got to have 5 fingers, rather than the spiritual form of the saint. So there's no layering of pigments, there's no dwelling on the process of deification, no loving look at the saint's image and character. But is it still an icon? We said, okay, well, it might screw up the iconographer a little bit, but what about the end result, especially if the iconographer then makes it material? So, okay, there's de-skilling. Well, let's talk first about icons in the liturgical community. Okay, digital dissemination of icons have made them more widely available, and it can't be denied that you can have a spiritual experience looking at an icon that came out of the printer or that is on a screen. Okay, but we do want to think about the role of the icon in the liturgical community. The icon has 2 functions. One is to teach. Icons have often been called theology in color. So an AI program can produce a theologically teaching-abled icon, right? But it might also produce something that is theologically suspect because it doesn't know the theology, right? The thing that I worry about is that with AI programs, producing an icon can become a do-it-yourself project. And anybody can produce their own icon. They can go to their computer, call up Midjourney and say, give me an icon of St. George slaying the dragon, and get an icon. They can also say, give me an icon of, St. John F. Kennedy. And then the liturgical community, at least the Orthodox Church, is going to say, wait a minute, he hasn't been sainted yet, So some of these icons might be able to teach, and some of them might not. So we don't really want to make AI a mediator for the liturgical community and its teaching. Basically, AI programs are loose cannons, okay? They can come up with, oops, that's not what I want. They can come up with icons that are liturgically good, and they can come up with icons, like here we have an icon of Saints Tea and Lemon, that probably the Orthodox community is going to say, no, we don't have Saints Tea and Lemon. This, you might consider this as a painting that is trying to make a point, which is maybe that tea and lemon are gifts from God, but you can't call it an icon. Okay, so I think the concern is, will icons become personal artifacts that people generate for themselves or for their own church without really being a part of the liturgical community? And then you can ask a valid question, which is, will this then broaden the idea of an icon? So that we can say, well, what about Saints Tea and Lemon? Maybe we're broadening icons to say, if God's divinity is in all things, an icon doesn't just have to depict the saints. It can depict natural objects, and we can see God's divinity in those things. Obviously, there's going to be disagreement on that point. Okay? Can a venerator of an icon that's generated by a computer have a spiritual experience? Well, here I want to quote the Orthodox priest Andrei Chirovsky, who says, icons are mainly about prayer. They're vehicles for spiritual ascent that, when created in conformity with the fullness of the Orthodox tradition, are enormously effective at drawing the faithful closer to the ultimate goal of theosis, or growing in the likeness of God. They're vehicles for spiritual ascent. Okay? And then he goes on to say, if you can get yourself in front of a correctly composed and executed hand-painted icon, go for it. But if the only thing available is a wall calendar with a second-rate rendering of the Man of Sorrows, throw yourself into it. The Lord is still there. As one pastor who experimented with religious chatbots said, if God can speak through all of creation, surely God can speak through the creations of God's creation. Well, AI takes this one step further. It asks God to speak through the creation of God's creation. Well, why not? Right? Clearly, all things are possible for God. I do worry a little bit, though, that at each remove it becomes more likely that one could veer from the path and make the very mistake that the iconoclasts feared, focusing on God's creation, the creation of God's creation, or even the creation of God's creation, and substituting our own desire for relationships that we can personalize and control, and for icons that we can personalize and control, which is, again, to quote Sherry Turkle, asking for love that is safe and made to measure. In other words, if we use these programs to personalize our experience with the divine, it might go well, but it also might not. So whether an icon generated by an AI program is truly an icon will ultimately be something for the Orthodox community to decide. Generative AI programs might seem like a really quick and easy way to get more icons into the world, but they might not be the best. For relationship with the real in all of the senses, the real world, the community of faith, the real community of saints, and above all, the Lord, who is ultimately the only thing that is real in this world, we may find that the best spiritual path is the slower one. Thank you. So did I answer the question? No. Can it be an icon? Sure. Might it raise problems? Sure.
Okay, we have
Questions?
time for questions.
There's one in front.
Right up at the front. Thank you.
Okay.
I have two questions. One is, if we approach this from the aspect of we're not looking for the same thing from an AI-generated icon that we're looking for from a human-generated icon, could we learn something different? In other words, if the AI is taking basically data and creating something from our human data, could we look at it as sort of like a mirror, maybe see things in what it sees that we might not be noticing ourselves? Because, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right that it might in many ways be more of a mirror than a window. So when we think of icons as a window to the divine, then we're not supposed to be thinking about ourselves or the human experience. But as a mirror, you are absolutely right that it may show us things about ourselves, our human experience, and our artistic creations. Because we all know that AI is excellent at discerning patterns in the data that we don't see.
Also, I was just curious about the language around AI, like using the language, it knows this, or it's discerning this, or that seems a little, this might be too much of a word, but dangerous to me, because it's not necessarily accurate, or maybe I don't think it's accurate. Yeah. Are there different language that we can use so that when we talk about AI, we're more in tune with what we're actually talking about? We're not humanizing.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of our language about AI does humanize it. But we have a problem because we don't know how to talk about it in any other way. When AI is doing things that humans normally do, we simply use the language that we have for doing that, and that is language that references back to the human. So, I think you're right that we need to be careful with our language. I think we especially need to be careful using language like it knows or it understands, because it doesn't know or understand anything in the way that humans know and understand. But we don't have any other language to use. Good questions.
I had a question about whether we can consider an analogy to like using electric instruments in worship. That was probably a big controversy for a lot of churches, in the middle of the 20th century. And for that matter, whether to use recordings of music during worship or really even for some to use instruments at all, whether or not to have that mediation. But I guess the question is, it goes back to that process versus product distinction you made yesterday. I think for some communities, there isn't the expertise or the resources perhaps to engage in the process, and that the product is kind of the only thing maybe that can enter them into that sense of comfort or familiarity that they want in worship. And I wonder the same thing with these kinds of icons, that it might be that this desire for democratization of access to this kind of icon isn't to try to cheapen it, but to try to grasp at something behind the curtain, something sacred that most people would have really no opportunity to study with someone who actually has done that. I just think that there's a lot of people who are already in this disconnected world trying to sort of find something of their own, even without the ability to get the community to engage in that process.
Yeah, I think you hit on several points there. I think the analogous thing to what you said about using, electric instruments or recorded music in worship was faced with icons when photography, lithography came in, and the church had to face the idea that, wow, now people are not going to be in front of a hand-painted icon, they're going to be in front of a reproduction. And a recording is a reproduction of music that's given. And then the Orthodox Church said, well, okay, we understand that a lot of people can't access or, afford hand-painted icons, so sure, a reproduction is fine if that's all. It's not as good, just as you'd probably say a recording of music in a worship service is probably not as good as having a choir and an organist or even a live band, because there's something, as you all know, why do we still have concerts, right? We still have concerts because there's something that happens when you're doing it live, when you're with other people who are producing the music, that's different than listening to a recording, even though we all are probably pretty grateful that we can also go home and listen to recordings of things. So, yeah, I think that's analogous. I think that the question, though, gets a different layer on it, just as you could put a different layer on worship music if you said, well, what if your worship music is not a recording of humans doing the music, it's totally AI generated?
That's my question.
And again, I think it's sort of like the final thing, you could still have a spiritual experience with totally AI generated music, but it's not going to be quite the same, nor is it going to be the same process for the musician who is maybe using an AI program and then tweaking the result and then tweaking the result again, as for the musician, who is actually playing an instrument or singing. It's just a different experience.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
My question is related to that. Is there any data or statistics on how many churches of any kind of religion have generated AI worship services totally?
No statistics yet. It's so new. You got to realize that we're only, about 2 years into this. These programs came out in, November, So it's so new that we haven't had a chance to look into that.
Just a shameless plug, the last moment here in our closing worship service, will be a worship service that was completely generated by generative AI, unedited. And so we will participate in a worship service. So don't leave. So we will participate in a worship service, including communion, that was written entirely, all of the songs, all of the liturgies, the sermon, by generative AI. And so this morning we've got a chance to engage this intellectually, but before we let you go, you'll have an opportunity to experience a worship service that was completely AI generated. So I hope you'll stay to experience that. And you can direct your emails afterwards to Mike Green right here. Anyway, continue with questions.
Maybe that should have been an announcement later on,
I was thinking about prayer. While I don't relate very well in my spiritual practice to icons, prayer is probably something that's more universal, maybe. So I was thinking, what about prayers that are already written? And there are people I know who would never offer a prayer that's already written. It must come from them. So I asked ChatGPT to pray for me and did issue a prayer, but it sounded more like it wasn't. It was the strangest. It was prayer-like language, but it did generate them. I asked it to draw a picture of me, but then it wanted more information. It didn't have enough data to just draw a picture of me. So I'm enjoying asking it questions.
Yeah, and it can do all that, and there are programs out there that are tailored strictly to generating prayers, so you can, so it isn't just ChatGPT, but you can actually find prayer programs, and you can ask for prayers for certain circumstances or situations, and it will generate them. But then, I want to come back to what you started with, is, okay, what is the purpose of prayer? And I think one of the things that AI is doing for us, I gave a talk at the University of Portland a couple of weeks ago, and this was about Catholic education and AI. And I said, it's making us ask the question, what is education for? What is the real purpose of education? Because as I said yesterday, if the students are using ChatGPT to write their papers and the teachers are using it to grade their papers, I think we've missed the purpose somehow. We have to rethink what our purposes are. And so I think as churches, we need to do the same thing. The Orthodox community is going to have to rethink, well, what is the purpose of an icon? How do we balance, the perfect with the good? Voltaire said, do not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. So we can clearly probably say, yes, a hand-painted icon done by an expert iconographer who is in a state of prayer the whole time is the ideal. But if we let that become the enemy of the good, it may mean that a lot of people don't have access to icons. The same thing with prayer. We may say, a prayer that is coming from the heart in the moment, maybe that is perfect. But for some people, they just don't know how to pray, or they're asked to give a prayer in public and they think my words won't be good enough. Maybe some help helps. Yeah.
So it strikes me that a little bit of what's at stake here is relationality.
Yep.
And I mean, prayer is such a good iteration of this. In the spiritual art of iconography, it's relationality in the creation of the icon between the iconographer and the divine, and then it's the relationality between the person utilizing the icon as a spiritual practice that then connects them to Christ or the saint or ultimately to God. And this returns us to your point yesterday about what does it mean to be human is our relationality. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about how you see relationality playing into
Yeah.
this conversation, particularly in
In many ways. I mean, first of all, there is this idea of the relationship between the iconographer and Christ or the saint. Then there is the relationship between the viewer and the iconographer. Ideally, this should happen within a worshiping community. And I think this is one of the concerns. Robert Bellah, who wrote Habits of the Heart, some of you probably read that many years ago. He said there's a problem out there that he called Sheilaism. And it was that he had interviewed a woman named Sheila who said, well, I take this from Christianity and this from Buddhism and this from Hinduism, and, I've put it all together and I basically have my own religion. But it's a religion of one, and that cuts into relationality. I think it's why most of us say religion is meant to be lived out in community. It's meant to be lived out together. So, this was one of my concerns about AI-generated icons, that they're meant to be generated within the community by members of the community for the community. And if it's as easy as each of us sitting down and saying to ChatGPT, give me an icon of whatever, it kind of risks isolating us from the community and letting each person have their own personal saints, their own personal icons. And that cuts into the relationship that we're all called to be in.
You mentioned the environmental impact of using AI with the data centers and the cloud, and recognizing that this is not something that's going to go away, and that there are other things like mining for Bitcoin that also have this huge, impact on the environment too. And thinking about how a lot of small churches can use AI as a tool to help them as they grow. What are some practical and responsible ways that we can learn about AI and use AI while still being mindful of the environmental impact that it has?
Well, that's a difficulty because it will have an environmental impact. I think one way we can do it is to be mindful. In other words, not to think of this as a toy. It's not a toy. We shouldn't play with it like it's a toy. So for a community to use it mindfully, I would say you should just use it, carefully. Know what you want before you approach the AI, and then approach the AI with as complete a prompt as you can, so that hopefully you get a result without having to do 50 iterations. Okay? So yeah, to use it, to think through what you want before you use it so that you don't have to just, right now everybody thinks, oh, this is free and it all happens up in the cloud and I'll just play with it till I get what I want. And that's, I think, an irresponsible way to use it. But if you approach it more carefully so that you know what you want, you've tailored your prompt, you give it and you maybe say, wow, almost there, let's just do one more, and change this or that. But you don't spend days, playing with it until you get what you want. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to be with you guys.